The Navy said he was a fake. Then one mark on his arm made everyone stop and listen. The morning at Harbor Point Naval Station began like any other community recognition event. Families walked between rows of flags, retired service members shared quiet conversations, and young sailors prepared for a ceremony honoring generations of those who had served. Among the visitors was William Carter, a 76-year-old man wearing a simple gray jacket, worn boots, and carrying himself with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. He arrived alone. He did not wear medals. He did not display old photographs. He did not tell stories about his past. When volunteers asked about his military background, he simply smiled and said he had once served with a special warfare unit many years ago. That answer caught the attention of Lieutenant James Reynolds, a young naval security officer responsible for checking visitor information during the event. James had spent years studying military records and understood the importance of protecting the reputation of elite units. To him, every claim needed verification. When he searched William Carter's information, the public records available to him showed very little. There were no recent documents confirming the details William mentioned. No online profile. No public history. Nothing that matched the image people expected from someone claiming a connection to an elite naval community. James approached William politely. "Sir, I need to ask a few additional questions about your service history." William looked at him calmly and nodded. Of course. There was no frustration in his voice. No anger. Only patience. James continued reviewing the information while several nearby guests began noticing the conversation. Some whispered that the elderly man might have misunderstood his own past. Others wondered why someone would make such a claim without evidence. William heard the quiet comments around him, but did not react. He simply stood beside a row of American flags, watching younger sailors prepare for the ceremony. His silence seemed unusual. Most people who were questioned immediately tried to defend themselves. William did not. That made James even more uncertain. "Mr. Carter, can you provide any identification connected to your service?" James asked. William slowly reached into his jacket and removed an old wallet. Inside were only a few personal items and a faded photograph. He looked at the picture for a moment before placing it back. "I do not carry much from those days anymore," he said. James studied his expression carefully. The answer was not what he expected. There was no attempt to impress anyone. No effort to create a dramatic moment. Just a quiet acceptance. Then, as William adjusted his sleeve, a small portion of an old tattoo became visible on his arm. It was only a few inches of faded ink, but the symbol caught the attention of a retired sailor standing nearby. The older sailor stepped closer, his expression changing instantly. He did not say anything. He simply looked at the mark, then looked back at William. James noticed the reaction and followed his eyes. For the first time that morning, he wondered if the mistake was not William's story. Perhaps the mistake was believing that every important history could be found inside a database. The tattoo was old. The records were incomplete. But the silence surrounding William Carter suddenly felt less like uncertainty and more like a secret waiting to be understood. The small symbol on William Carter's arm was only visible for a few seconds, but those few seconds changed the entire atmosphere around him. The retired sailor who had noticed it stepped back quietly, studying the elderly man's face as if trying to connect a memory from many years ago. Lieutenant James Reynolds noticed the reaction immediately. He had expected uncertainty. He had expected hesitation. He had not expected recognition. William gently lowered his sleeve and looked toward the older sailor. Neither man spoke. Their silence created more questions than any explanation could have. James approached again, this time with a different tone. The confidence he had carried earlier was replaced by careful curiosity. "Sir, may I ask where you received that tattoo?" William looked down at his arm for a moment. The faded mark had followed him for decades, yet he treated it like something private rather than something impressive. "A long time ago," he answered. "It belonged to a chapter of my life that ended many years ago." James studied the response. It was not a denial. It was not a confirmation. It was simply the answer of someone who did not feel the need to convince anyone. The retired sailor finally spoke. "Lieutenant, that symbol is not something you see every day." His voice remained calm, but the respect behind his words was obvious. "Do you know what it represents?" James shook his head. "No, sir." The older sailor looked back at William, almost as if asking permission to continue. William gave a small nod, but offered no further explanation. Some things from certain units were never placed on public records, the sailors said. Not because they were forgotten, because the people involved wanted the mission to matter more than their names. James listened carefully. The explanation challenged everything he had assumed that morning. He had trusted databases, official documents, and visible proof. Those things were important. They protected organizations and maintained accountability. But standing in front of William Carter, he began to understand that some forms of service existed beyond public recognition. A security supervisor nearby approached after noticing the growing conversation. "Lieutenant, is there an issue?" James looked at William before answering. "I am verifying some information, sir." The supervisor glanced toward the elderly man, then toward the tattoo. His expression changed slightly, but he said nothing. That reaction did not escape James. Within minutes, the situation that had started as a simple verification process became something much more complicated. A few guests who had earlier questioned William now watched quietly from a distance. The assumptions they had made were beginning to feel uncomfortable. William remained calm throughout it all. He accepted the questions. He accepted the uncertainty. He accepted being misunderstood. What surprised James most was that the elderly man never once tried to use his past as a shield. He could have raised his voice. He could have demanded recognition. Instead, he stood beneath the American flag and waited patiently for the truth to arrive on its own. James returned to his office area and opened additional records. He searched carefully, entering every piece of information available. Still, nothing appeared that explained the symbol on William's arm. The absence of information only created a deeper mystery. Then his secure communication device displayed an incoming message from a senior naval office. The message contained only a few words: "Send a clear image of the tattoo immediately." James stared at the screen. Someone, somewhere, understood exactly what William Carter was carrying with him. And for the first time that day, James wondered if he had been investigating a fake seal, or if he had accidentally questioned someone whose story was far more important than any database could reveal. The message requesting a clear image of the tattoo changed the quiet atmosphere at Harbor Point Naval Station. Lieutenant James Reynolds looked at the screen for several seconds before moving. The instruction came from a senior naval office, and the wording was simple, but the meaning behind it felt significant. Someone with authority wanted to know exactly what symbol was on William Carter's arm. James walked back toward the ceremony area, but this time his approach was different. He was no longer searching for a mistake. He was searching for the truth. William remained near the American flags, watching sailors prepare for the event with the same calm expression he had shown since arriving. When James approached, the elderly veteran looked up and gave a polite nod. "Mr. Carter, I need your permission to document the tattoo for verification purposes." William studied the young officer for a moment before answering. "If it helps you find your answer, go ahead." There was no bitterness in his voice, no frustration from being questioned. That surprised James more than anything else. The retired sailor who had first recognized the symbol stood nearby, observing quietly. As James carefully captured the image, he noticed details he had missed earlier. The tattoo was not designed to attract attention. It was faded, simple, and clearly old. It looked less like a symbol meant for display and more like a personal reminder carried through an entire lifetime. The image was sent through the secure system. For several minutes, nothing happened. James returned his attention to William. "You never tried to explain yourself," he said. William looked toward the ceremony preparations. "Sometimes explanations are not enough. People believe what they are ready to believe." The answer stayed with James. He had spent his career learning how to identify information, verify records, and follow procedures. Those skills mattered. They protected the service he represented. But he was beginning to understand that not every valuable story could be found by searching a computer screen. A notification finally appeared on his device. The response was not from the local office. It came from a higher level of command. James opened the message carefully. The first sentence made him pause. "Image received. Do not continue questioning the individual." He read the line again. The wording was professional, but the instruction carried unusual importance. Another message followed moments later. "Maintain respectful contact. Senior leadership has been notified." James slowly lowered the device. He looked toward William, who was still standing peacefully among the other guests, completely unaware of the conversation happening around him. Or perhaps he was aware and simply chose not to react. That possibility made James even more curious. The young officer returned to his supervisor and explained that the matter was being reviewed by higher command. The supervisor listened carefully but asked no unnecessary questions. In military environments, experience often taught people when not to interrupt a process they did not fully understand. Meanwhile, William accepted a cup of coffee from a volunteer and thanked her warmly. He spoke with retired sailors, asked about their families, and showed genuine interest in everyone around him. Nothing about him suggested someone seeking attention. Nothing about him matched the image James had expected when the investigation began. Then the secure communication device rang again. This time, the message contained only one sentence. Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker is requesting immediate confirmation of the visitor's identity. James froze for a moment. The name carried weight. A vice admiral did not become involved in ordinary verification matters. He looked back at William Carter standing beneath the flag, an elderly man who had arrived quietly with no medals, no announcement, and no request for recognition. Yet somehow, one faded tattoo had reached the highest levels of naval leadership. James finally understood that the mystery was not whether William had a story. The mystery was how important that story had been all along. The arrival of Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker changed the atmosphere at Harbor Point Naval Station before anyone saw him. Within minutes, conversations became quieter, officers adjusted their posture, and the routine energy of the community event shifted into something more serious. Lieutenant James Reynolds stood near the ceremony area, watching the entrance road while trying to understand what had brought such a senior naval leader to a simple gathering. William Carter remained unaware of the attention surrounding him, or at least he appeared that way. He continued speaking with retired sailors, asking about their families and listening carefully to their stories. He carried himself like a man who valued people more than recognition. When the official vehicle finally arrived, Vice Admiral Whitaker stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed uniform and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades making important decisions. He did not immediately address the officers waiting for him. His eyes moved across the crowd until they found William standing beneath the American flag. For a moment, the Vice Admiral stopped. It was not hesitation. It was recognition. James noticed the change instantly. This was not the reaction of a commander meeting a stranger. This was the reaction of someone seeing a piece of history standing in front of him. Whitaker walked across the ceremony area without rushing. The crowd watched quietly as he approached William. The elderly veteran looked up and gave a respectful nod. "Admiral," William said calmly. Whitaker returned the greeting with a slight smile. "Mr. Carter, I was hoping I would never have to meet you this way." The sentence surprised everyone nearby. James looked between the two men, trying to understand the meaning behind the words. Whitaker glanced briefly at William's arm where the faded tattoo had been visible earlier. "I received the image," he said quietly. William looked down and smiled faintly. "I wondered if someone would recognize it eventually." The Vice Admiral studied him for a moment. Most people would have explained themselves immediately. William gave a small shrug. There was a time when that symbol explained everything. Now it is only a reminder. Those words stayed in James's mind. The young officer had expected someone with a hidden past to be eager to reveal it. Instead, William seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. Whitaker turned toward James and the nearby security staff. "Lieutenant Reynolds, may I ask what happened before my arrival?" James took a breath and answered honestly. "Sir, Mr. Carter's identity was questioned because his public records did not confirm his statement about his service history." The Vice Admiral nodded slowly. "And what did you discover?" James looked at William before responding. "That some histories are not visible in public records." A brief silence followed. Whitaker gave a small approving nod. "That is an important lesson." He then looked around at the gathering of sailors and veterans. There are people whose service cannot be measured by how often their names appear in databases. Some of the most important contributions in our history were made by individuals who never wanted attention. William gently shook his head. "Admiral, I was only one person among many." Whitaker smiled. "That is exactly what makes you different, Mr. Carter." The surrounding crowd remained quiet, sensing that something meaningful was unfolding. The man they had questioned only hours earlier was now standing beside one of the Navy's highest-ranking leaders. Yet William did not appear changed by the recognition. He still looked like the same elderly man who had arrived alone that morning. James watched carefully and finally understood the difference between someone seeking a title and someone who had already earned respect long before anyone noticed. The Vice Admiral had not come to create a legend. He had arrived because he recognized one. Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker remained beside William Carter for several quiet moments, allowing the significance of the meeting to settle naturally among the people watching nearby. He did not introduce William with dramatic words. He did not announce achievements or list years of service. Instead, he simply stood beside him, showing respect through his presence alone. Lieutenant James Reynolds noticed that more than anything else, the highest-ranking officer at the gathering was not treating William like someone who needed to prove himself. He was treating him like someone whose character had already answered every question. Whitaker eventually turned toward the gathered sailors and veterans. "Many of you are wondering about the symbol you saw today," he said. "You are also wondering why it was never found in ordinary records." The crowd listened carefully. William remained silent, standing slightly behind the Vice Admiral, as if he preferred not to be the center of attention. Years ago, certain special operations communities maintained traditions that were known only among those who served within them, Whitaker continued. Not every mark, every story, or every sacrifice was placed into public view. Some things were kept private because the people involved believed the work mattered more than recognition. James listened closely. The explanation was different from what he expected. He had assumed missing records meant missing truth. Now he understood that sometimes missing information simply meant the story belonged to a different time and a different group of people. Whitaker looked toward William's faded tattoo. That symbol was never meant to prove someone's importance. It represented a promise between people who trusted each other completely. William quietly interrupted. "Admiral, it represented a team, not one person." The Vice Admiral nodded. "That answer is exactly why. It still matters." Several retired sailors exchanged knowing looks. They understood something the younger generation was only beginning to learn. The most respected individuals were often the ones who avoided talking about themselves. James stood nearby, remembering his own words from earlier that morning. He had questioned William because the evidence was not immediately visible. He had trusted what appeared on a screen more than what stood in front of him. Now he realized that experience required more than information. It required judgment. Whitaker turned back toward him. "Lieutenant, do you know what the most dangerous mistake a leader can make?" James answered carefully. "Assuming they already know everything, sir." The Vice Admiral gave a slight smile. "Exactly." William looked at the young officer with a calm expression. There was no disappointment in his eyes, only understanding. "Every generation has to learn that lesson in its own way," he said. "The important thing is whether they choose to learn it." Those words affected James more than any official correction could have. He had expected a confrontation. He had expected criticism. Instead, he received patience from the very person he had doubted. Later that afternoon, the event continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People who had ignored William earlier now approached him with genuine respect. They asked questions, not because they wanted proof, but because they wanted to understand. William answered some and politely declined others. He never turned the moment into a personal celebration. He continued doing what he had done all day, listening, showing kindness, and allowing others to decide what his story meant. As the sun moved lower over Harbor Point Naval Station, James watched William standing beneath the American flag. The elderly veteran looked exactly the same as when he arrived. The only difference was that everyone else finally saw what had been there from the beginning. The afternoon at Harbor Point Naval Station continued with a different feeling than when it had begun. The same people who had watched William Carter with uncertainty were now looking at him with genuine respect. Yet William himself had not changed. He still stood quietly, spoke softly, and carried the same humble expression he had worn when he first arrived. For him, the attention was never the purpose. The people were. Lieutenant James Reynolds noticed that difference more clearly than anyone else. Earlier that day, he had approached William with suspicion because he believed every important story needed immediate proof. Now he understood that leadership was not only about verifying information. It was about recognizing the person behind it. As the ceremony preparations continued, James found a moment to speak with William privately near the edge of the parade ground. The sounds of sailors organizing equipment and families gathering for the event filled the background, but the conversation between the two remained quiet. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology," James said. William looked at him calmly. "For what?" James hesitated. "For assuming that because I could not find your history quickly, it meant there was no history to find." William gave a small smile. "You were doing your job, Lieutenant. Questions are not disrespectful. How you treat people while asking them is what matters." James remembered those words. They were simple, but they carried the weight of decades of experience. He had expected William to be disappointed. Instead, the elderly veteran had given him understanding. "How did you learn to stay calm when people questioned you?" James asked. William looked across the base toward the younger sailors preparing for their future careers. "Time teaches you that not every battle is worth fighting. Sometimes the truth does not need someone to defend it. It only needs time to appear." James looked down for a moment, thinking about how quickly he had judged the situation. The lesson was not only about William's past. It was about the kind of leader James wanted to become. Nearby, Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker continued speaking with senior officers. He watched William from a distance, knowing exactly why the elderly veteran had earned so much respect. It was not only because of what he had done years earlier. It was because of who he remained afterward. Many people could carry impressive titles. Far fewer could carry them with humility. Later, as the ceremony began, William was invited to stand among retired service members. He politely accepted but avoided standing in the center. He encouraged others to step forward first. James noticed that small action and understood something important. William was not humble because he lacked confidence. He was humble because he understood that service was never about one person alone. The ceremony ended with the American flag moving gently in the afternoon breeze. Families applauded, sailors stood respectfully, and veterans shared stories from different generations. William listened more than he spoke. When someone asked him about his years in service, he simply smiled and said that the best memories were always about the people beside him. James watched him leave the gathering later that day. There was no dramatic announcement, no attempt to reclaim attention. William walked toward his old vehicle just as quietly as he had arrived. But the people watching him now saw something different. They no longer saw an elderly man with a forgotten tattoo. They saw someone who had carried a lifetime of service without ever needing to announce it. And James Reynolds understood that the greatest lessons are sometimes delivered by the people who ask for nothing in return. The days following the Heritage Day gathering brought a quiet change to Harbor Point Naval Station. There were no headlines, no public announcements, and no dramatic celebrations. Yet among the sailors, veterans, and officers who had witnessed what happened, the name William Carter carried a different meaning. People who once saw him as a question now saw him as a reminder of what service truly represented. Lieutenant James Reynolds felt that change more than anyone. The young officer continued his regular responsibilities, but his perspective had shifted. Every time he reviewed a document or evaluated a situation, he remembered the elderly veteran standing calmly beneath the American flag. He remembered how quickly he had trusted missing information instead of considering the possibility that the story was simply deeper than what appeared on a screen. A few days later, James requested a meeting with Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker. He wanted to understand more about the symbol William carried and why it had created such a strong reaction. The Vice Admiral agreed to speak with him in a quiet office overlooking the naval base. "Lieutenant, what do you want to know?" Whitaker asked. James thought carefully before answering. "I want to understand how someone can have such an important history and still choose to live so quietly." The Vice Admiral looked out the window toward the harbor. "Because people like William Carter never believed the mission was about themselves." He paused for a moment. Many young leaders think recognition is the result of service. They eventually learn that recognition is only a side effect. The real purpose is responsibility. James listened carefully. Whitaker explained that the older generation of special warfare communities often valued teamwork, trust, and discipline above personal attention. Their identity was built around the people beside them, not the names remembered afterward. "That tattoo was never a decoration," Whitaker said. "It was a reminder of a promise made among people who depended on each other." James nodded slowly. He understood now why William had never used it to defend himself. The symbol was not a tool for gaining respect. It was something meaningful because of what it represented, not because of what it could prove. Later that week, James visited William at a small veterans gathering near the coast. The meeting was informal. There were no cameras, no ceremonies, and no officers standing in formation. Just veterans sharing coffee, stories, and memories. William greeted James with the same kindness he had shown from the beginning. "I did not expect to see you here," William said with a smile. James replied honestly, "I wanted to thank you, not only for your patience, but for the lesson." William listened quietly. "Every generation learns the same lessons in different ways," he said. "The important thing is making sure those lessons continue." Around them, older veterans shared stories with younger service members. Some spoke about challenges. Others spoke about friendships. None of them focused on personal achievements. James noticed that William listened more than he spoke, just like before. That was when he truly understood the difference between someone who wanted to be remembered and someone who had already made an impact. As the sun lowered over the coastline, James watched William leave the gathering. The elderly veteran walked slowly toward his vehicle, carrying the same quiet confidence he had always carried. The tattoo on his arm remained faded. The story behind it remained private. But the lesson it represented had become clear. True service does not demand attention. It earns respect through the lives it quietly influences. The weeks after William Carter's story became known at Harbor Point Naval Station passed quietly, but the impact of that single day continued to grow. The people who had witnessed the misunderstanding never forgot the image of an elderly veteran standing calmly while others questioned his past. They remembered how quickly assumptions had changed when the truth finally appeared. For Lieutenant James Reynolds, the experience became a lesson he carried into every decision afterward. He began looking beyond documents and appearances, understanding that leadership required patience before judgment. Meanwhile, William returned to his simple routine. He did not seek invitations, interviews, or public recognition. He continued visiting local veterans gatherings, spending time with former service members, and encouraging younger generations who wanted to understand the meaning of commitment. One afternoon, Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker contacted William with an unexpected request. The Navy base was preparing a small leadership event for younger sailors and officers, and Whitaker wanted William to attend. "They need to hear your perspective," the Vice Admiral explained. William smiled politely. "Admiral, there are many people with better stories than mine." Whitaker replied, "That may be true. But sometimes the most important lessons come from people who never believe they are the most important person in the room." William agreed to attend. When the day arrived, the gathering was simple. There were no large ceremonies, no dramatic introductions, and no attempt to turn the event into a celebration of one individual. Young sailors, officers, and veterans gathered in a quiet hall overlooking the harbor. The American flag stood near the front of the room, and photographs of previous generations of service members lined the walls. James Reynolds was also there. He watched as William walked into the room, carrying the same calm presence he had shown from the beginning. Some younger sailors recognized him immediately. Others only knew that a respected vice admiral had invited him to speak. William stood before the group and looked around the room. "I am not here to tell you about myself," he began. "I am here to remind you about the people beside you." The room became completely quiet. William explained that service was never built by one person alone. Every mission, every responsibility, and every accomplishment depended on trust between individuals. He spoke about listening before judging, respecting experience, and understanding that leadership was measured by how people treated others when nobody was watching. James listened carefully because he recognized the message. It was the same lesson William had given him on the day they met. The young officer had once searched for proof of who William was. Now he understood that William's character had revealed more than any document could. After the discussion ended, several sailors approached William and thanked him. They asked questions about leadership, discipline, and the changes he had seen throughout his life. William answered each question with patience. He never presented himself as a legend. He spoke like a man who had simply learned from decades of experience. Before leaving, Vice Admiral Whitaker handed William a small challenge coin. "Not for what you did decades ago," he said. "For the example you continue to set today." William accepted it with gratitude, but quickly turned the attention back toward the younger sailors. That moment confirmed everything James had learned. The most respected people were often the ones who did not ask to be remembered. They simply lived in a way that made remembering them impossible to avoid. The morning sun rose over Harbor Point Naval Station, casting a warm glow across the harbor where generations of sailors had started and ended their journeys. Months had passed since William Carter first walked through those gates, but the lesson from that day remained with everyone who had witnessed it. What began as a moment of doubt became a reminder that appearances rarely tell the complete story. William continued living the same quiet life he had always lived. He still visited veterans' gatherings, still listened more than he spoke, and still believed that the greatest achievements belonged to the people who stood beside him. The faded tattoo on his arm remained exactly the same. It was never restored, never displayed, and never used to demand respect. It simply remained a small reminder of a chapter that shaped the person he became. Lieutenant James Reynolds often thought about that. The young officer had changed in ways he never expected. Before meeting William, he believed leadership was built mostly through knowledge, procedures, and preparation. Those things were important, but William taught him something deeper. Leadership was also built through humility, patience, and the willingness to understand people before making conclusions. During a later ceremony at Harbor Point, James stood among sailors, veterans, and families as William was invited to attend once again. This time, there were no questions about his identity. There were no doubts about his past. But William remained exactly the same person who had arrived months earlier. He walked slowly across the grounds, greeted everyone warmly, and thanked people for their kindness. Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker joined him near the ceremony area. The two men watched younger sailors preparing for their own futures. "Do you ever miss those days?" the Vice Admiral asked. William smiled softly. "I miss the people, not the years themselves." Whitaker nodded because he understood. True service was never about holding on to the past. It was about carrying its lessons forward. Before the ceremony ended, James approached William one final time. "I used to think respect came from what people could prove," James said. "Now I understand it comes from what people consistently show through their actions." William looked at him and smiled. That is a lesson worth remembering. Around them, the American flag moved gently in the ocean breeze. Veterans stood beside young sailors. Different generations shared the same space, connected by the values that had guided them all. Nobody needed a dramatic announcement. Nobody needed a reminder of what William Carter represented. The respect was already there. As William prepared to leave, several sailors offered their thanks. He accepted each one with humility and reminded them that every person who serves has a story worth honoring. Then he walked toward his vehicle, just as quietly as he had arrived. James watched him go and realized something important. The world often searches for heroes through visible symbols, official records, and public recognition. But some heroes carry their greatest achievements in silence. Some people do not need to prove they belong in history because their actions have already written their place within it. William Carter never asked anyone to remember his name. He only showed them the meaning of service. And that was why they never forgot him.